And welcome to the Thoth Witchcraft short course in Necromancy. We are going to be having an emphasis on the practicality of necromancy. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever I research necromancy, all I can find is historic references, literary references, not even actual practice. Why is that? Is someone keeping something in a vault in a museum somewhere and isn't willing to share it? Or what is going on with that?
Well, the point is we only have that. In the areas we're talking about in the West, the practical parts don't survive. They rot away. So, unless somebody's made a megalinth for it, then it's not going to happen. So, at the end of the day, you find the odd tomb here and there. You find what bits in there that aren't perishable, but that doesn't tell you about what the actual practice does. We can make assumptions, but a classicist or an archaeologist or a historian's not going to make those assumptions. They're going to try and draw attention based on what they can match up with the literary experience.
So basically what you're saying is there isn't really any actual manuals, I suppose, left by the people that carried out.
No.
So obviously you're talking a lot about oral tradition, certainly in Europe, until the Christians come along and start writing things down. Not necessarily 100% accurate, because they're looking through a different lens.
And very specific subjects.
But in terms of obviously some cultures, I mean hieroglyphics now, Egyptian hieroglyphics, is somewhat understood, or archaeologists believe that they understand how to read them. Cultures like that kind of did, you've got the idea of the Egyptian Book of the Dead. There is information written in there, but is there really any practice?
You've also got to factor in, which is the other bit that they don't tend to cover, which is that Egyptology particularly was founded during the Victorian period and therefore has a very Victorian lens. The chronology is fixed to a very Christian Victorian idea of how the world works. And therefore, when you look at the ways in which they have translated those practices, should we say, they've done it from that point of view, and that point of view hasn't moved. So, however much certain Egyptologists try to make that change, it's not happened yet. It's still very fixed within a very kind of classical view, and by that I mean a Victorian one. So it is a case of there is enough out there if you were to understand it. But I think without you doing soul work yourself and actually reading the text afresh with an ancestral part in mind, I don't think you're going to see it.
Yeah, I think that, they do say certain things you have to be initiated and understand to know to read the text. So if it's a beginner, I'm thinking about beginners mainly, because we might look at something and think, oh, I know what's going on there, whereas the absolute beginner, if you pick up a book on Greco-roman necromantic practices, and it's an academic text and not one which is basically a practitioner that's written something that they think is somewhat Greco-roman, you're not going to get a manual, are you? It's not going to.
At the very best, you're going to get a description of customs at best. You might find out about a few different kinds of vessels that they might have used, perfume bottles or libation cups, or crockery for those things. You might get depictions of other worlds. You might get depictions of the underworld and what the Greco-Romans imagine that to be actually look like. But you've also got to remember that that works hand in hand with the oral tradition. So what's going on the pottery is also going on in the stories that are being told. So, you know, they very much were a literary, I want to say race then, but you know, people. You know, it was a case of everything was handed down. Very few people would have been literate, and therefore everything they learned was from images or from oral tradition. So, you know, even if you take Odyssey or the Iliad by Homer, like those two, you're looking at something that is attributed to Homer. Like, Homer's long dead by the time it's written anywhere. But you can already see it in the pottery because it was clearly a popular story. Therefore, that matches up quite nicely with what's going on in the mythology around it. But that's not necessarily telling you the custom. So you get bits and pieces from the text that we've got, but you've got to remember it takes a long time to translate a text, and there are literally thousands of the things. You've also got to remember where we find them. So the best record we've got is from a slide near Herculaneum, where you've got an entire library, but it's charred. There was a fire, and we haven't managed to actually find an effective way of unrolling the scrolls in order to read them. So whereas most of what we've got otherwise is from garbage sites. So you know they were popular books because they made it into the rubbish. They weren't kept long enough for them to be precious kind of items in a library. They've been used and thrown away, at which point says that is common. So the nice bit about that is it confirms that was what was available readily to a lot of people. But again, it's storytelling, and anything that was done in a cultural sense, that for like hardcore witchcraft or practice would have been held in the mysteries.
Or it would have been just so personal, like folkloric traditions that you see nowadays. It's just, well, everyone in the village does that.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't think twice about, you know, recording it. It's just something that's always been.
Yeah.
And I think the breakdown, certainly when it comes to folklore, you see these practices after a generation, even sometimes, a couple of generations, you start to forget why you do these things.
Yeah.
And then they're forgotten entirely and no longer done.
And then they become superstition.
Yeah.
And then it's a case of you only remember them out of superstition.
Yeah.
So, you know, like counting magpies or picking a penny up. Like, you know, there are reasons why we do those. We've just long forgotten them.
I do pick a penny up. Find a penny, pick it up, and all day you'll have good luck. I always take it and I always put it in a little pot, and then whenever I want to do a magical money work in, I always pick it up and feel like, well, I've already been given something. Let's expand on this little bit of luck.
Expand on that one.
Yeah. The transmutation of bad things as well. That's another thing. But we won't go into that because, of course, this is about necromancy. Okay, so in terms of what I see a lot of people do, particularly left-brainy people, is I think that they try to get as much information as possible.
Yeah.
And then logically hoard it all, but then try and find what the common threads are.
Yeah.
So if you do look at what we do have from an ancient perspective of necromancy, because at least with the modern stuff, even when you're going back to cunning folk practice and stuff like that, there is enough still within our culture, I think.
Yeah.
Or
to
it's
kind of
fairly recent.
Reach back through that ancestral.
Whereas when you're looking at other cultures, that can be a lot different, a lot more complicated, because you don't necessarily understand that culture.
Also, it depends on where we come from. I think a lot of people forget quite how tribal parts of this history are.
Yeah.
So if you're looking Greco-roman, that would depend on particularly what polis state you were actually living in.
Yeah.
Could be completely different from one end of Greece to another. So you're trying to draw in these little parallels from a whole range of sources. And you think, well, actually, that area is going to be completely different to what they do over there.
Yeah.
The customs of Sparta are going to be very different to Athens. Like, but that doesn't seem to be taken into practice when they're actually looking at it like that, because they've hoarded all this information and then decided, well, there must be some common thread, but then you're not really at that point having an authentic practice on the fact that you aren't specifying one particular.
Well, I mean, cast your mind back to school. You'd get these little books, a history of Romans, the history of the Vikings, that kind of thing. It's like, oh well, here's a culture, everyone's the same. It stayed like this for X amount of time. And obviously, unless you go and do that in higher education, you're going to still think that it's a cohesive group. I think nothing really stands out more nowadays with conversations that I have with people is the whole Norse thing. You know, it's kind of like, I mean, the Celtic, if you call it Celtic, and then you've got Old Norse, that kind of thing. There's no cohesiveness really at all whatsoever.
But again, really it's tribal. So you would have had one specific tribe would have done a specific way of honouring the dead, a specific way of burying the dead, and a specific way of then celebrating year after year or whatever. You know, because at the end of the day, they were more seasonal for starters, in the sense that they would have had a down period before the warring starts again the next year. So, you know, they're not going to be fighting battles during the winter period where it's too harsh for them to either feed themselves. So that kind of dark period is going to be the period that you experience the ancestors and welcome them in to protect you, and then gear yourself up ready for the next warring time. Like, so, you know, that kind of organic part of it that naturally flows with the season makes sense.
Unless you're desperate, because the only times when you've got the battles is literally when we stock cover the pantries, it's all run dry. You know, we're gonna have to go and steal someone else's grain, sort of thing. Yeah, it's like that film. Is it A Bug's Life, or is it Ants, where you've got like the ants that do all of the work, and then all of a sudden you've got these killer bugs that come along and try. Watch that film. Is it Disney?
No, it is A Bug's Life.
It's A Bug's Life.
Yeah,
right, okay.
It is A Bug's Life, because you've got the circus bugs.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
Yeah, Bug's Life.
So in terms of when we design things from a necromantic perspective, not necessarily for our own work, because we obviously have our go-to things that are too tailored for us, and that are no longer universal. Once you start getting out of foundational magic, things become too personal to yourself, your energy, and the things that you work with. So obviously, in terms of giving someone a foundation, our starting point, I like to draw on common things that people can Google, that people can go ahead and look on, whether it be, you know, histories of working with bones and things like that. But there are quite a lot of there's a lot of common ground between necromantic practices with different cultures and things like that. So if we have a little talk about that, and then go from the little bits and pieces that we like to pick from that and the reasons why, because I think that on most courses and most books, the explanation isn't really given as to the why. Why do you use this? You know, there might be in an academic text some reference towards practice, but they don't necessarily, either because they don't know,
or it's not appropriate in that manner to talk about it. Because these, at the end of the day, these aren't spiritual texts. These aren't practical guide texts. These are written for a historical purpose. So it's a case of going, well, this is how it was done, and I know it because of this evidence and that evidence, as opposed to going, if I wanted to recreate a Greek burial followed by necromantic practices, you would then kind of go, okay, well, this isn't going to get published. So, you know, like, unless you are going to then go to the esoteric area of the publishing world where nobody knows who you are, like, you know, you're going to kind of
there are some good books that have been published in the esoteric, but they're not mainstream publishing houses. They're short runs, and some of them go for a considerable amount of money. And really, if you take some of these texts and really look, they will work for a beginner, and you will gain a lot of knowledge, but a lot of it really should be common sense.
Yeah.
So it's really just kind of like the little hint that you get if you can't solve a puzzle. It's really
Yeah.
like that. I mean,
it's the personal elements that they've tweaked out of practicing that for a certain amount of time, rather than actually this is a fundamental aspect of necromantic practice.
Yeah.
You're going to get the nuances of actually how they make it specifically Greco-Roman or Egyptian or whatever.
Yeah.
But they are there. It's just, like I said, it's beyond beginners, so therefore it's more personal. I think you're definitely right on that. It's hard to then kind of peel that back for when it's written in that way, because you've got to write the next more interesting book than the other. You've got to be adding something extra. Whereas, I think the basics. So the basics would be necromancy in its core. So traditionally, it's coming from the word of divining the future. It's about contacting the dead to get information. It's only later that it gets corrupted in this kind of, I want to bring the dead back or whatever. You know, from all the reading I've ever done, there is very little focus of that in the Egyptian practices about bringing back. It's about preserving for the afterlife. Same with the Greco-Romans, the same with the Vikings. It's about making sure you are safe in whatever heaven you are in. So the actual practice is about having a connection to them for information. What can we get to keep the tribe safe? What can we do to make sure I'm just as safe as you? It's not like it is today where people want to speak to grandma because they miss her. That they believe in most of these tribal kind of relationships is that the ancestors are always there. That's a core part of their belief system, is that they are contactable. Therefore, they're not in need of going to a medium to go, how's Granny doing? Is she okay with what I've done? Does she know about that new guy I've just started dating? Like, that kind of information is not what you would have typically gone to the ancestors for. You've gone, how do I keep the tribe safe? Are we going to have enough rain this season? Like, are the crops going to do well? You know, they're events that kind of decide whether or not that tribe is going to survive the next season. And we're not used to that. We live in a very comfortable world where all of that is kind of guaranteed. Tesco is still going to keep being there. Like, you know, so we haven't got to go, will there be my favourite pot of strawberry compote available at Tesco next week? Like, that's the level that we're at. So, of course, what seems fairly trivial to ask the dead about now is, you know,
people
Tommy
live
looked
quite
at me.
comfortably, don't they?
Tommy looked at me. Does that mean he likes me? Like, so sorry, have I gone off on a tangent?
No, I think that makes sense.
I'm trying to contextualize it to the point of, so what do you really use necromancy for? What's the point of working with the dead?
Well, I think that it wouldn't be a Thoth talk or a Thoth documentary interview if we didn't at some point shit on other people's magical practice.
Okay.
So in terms of the ways in which people are drawn to the path and then the errors that you might find in specific styles of practice, I think that's an important thing to highlight, because again, when you're talking about dealing with the dead or necromancy, and a lot of people aren't going to think of things in terms of necromancy. They're not going to call it necromancy. No. They're going to call it ancestral work, or even working with the dead, contacting the dead. So really, from my perspective, what I tend to find is you have the people which don't have magical experience, that don't have a lot of magical knowledge, that normally it's a loss that tends to trigger it. They want to cling on to someone to see, is there anyone there? Mum, granddad, son, daughter's died. You know, what is going on here? And you see that really in the culture.
Are they okay?
Yeah.
Did they get there okay? Did they suffer? That sort of comfort of, oh, well, they made it there, so they're safe. But it's that kind of, like you say, it's a loss. It's are they okay? Are they still with me? I don't want to let go just yet. Like,
And it, to a certain extent, depending on the approach, you need to be making progress. Because if you're not making progress with that, it becomes an addiction to a certain extent.
Yeah.
I mean, these sorts of people will go to a psychic and then get an experience with the psychic that they feel the psychic is picking up on something, and you do see them get addicted to having to go back to that psychic. Oh, I just need to
Every
talk
2
to mum
months,
again.
gotta see
I
somebody.
just need to talk to granddad again. The paranormal investigators.
Yeah.
That's a that's a whole different kettle of fish, because again, with them you've normally got, unless it's people that are paid to investigate a problem, you've got these groups of people which are banding together for so quote unquote exploring
or experiments,
but they're not really this. They're the same experiments. They do the same thing over and over and over again. Normally take quite a scientific method, and normally there's no magical practice involved. And what you need to remember is that, you know, there's a reason why the dead and ghosts and that kind of thing are associated with magic. Magical practice, dealing with it in a magical way, will get you an awful lot further. And when magicians and witches make strides, and, you know, things then start to enter into the scientific world and into academia and that kind of thing, when too many people have the experience and it breaks down, then that is when normally it enters into science, which of course science and religion and magic have always kind of been the same.
Well, yeah,
it's only nowadays that
all of science was once magic.
Yeah, essentially. But in terms of like the approaches that people tend to take, you also have the third party, the magical practitioner that needs to go to the extreme and go overboard.
Yeah.
So you will find endless amounts of books on necromancy, and they always call it necromancy, not so much working with the dead.
Yeah.
And all it involves is the most grotesque things and creepy things.
Lots of blood, lots of bodies.
Yeah.
One thing I do find interesting though is, which is really odd, because obviously we were both doing some research about this because it's not a huge part of our practice, so we need to make sure we're up to date. But I was reading there were the occasional manual that you can get hold of online, and one was kind of like, there was a big section about necrophilia, and how it's a no-no. Like, it was a categoric, I know the dead are alluring, but you must not desecrate. Like, and it was really interesting to kind of see that, because to us, you know, any kind of other spirit work is not done in the physical. So, you know, I take it, you know, invocation for sex magic or whatever is something that is quite okay in other parts of our, you know, our practice and other people's practice. But there was just that kind of, you must not. And I'm like, I get it. I really understand why. But at the same time, like, you need to write that down. Like, it needs to be a rule. Anyway, sideline of, I was reading some really interesting necromantic ones, and they've got a very Christian feel to them. I don't know if that's what you get to, but there's kind of, there's very much a kind of series of taboos that have been kind of built in, because the practice has gone a step too far by somebody at some point, I imagine.
Well, partly, I mean, when you're talking about Christianity and talking about the church, then working with the dead in Protestantism, apart from Jesus, because technically he was a dead guy, that's fine.
Dead guy.
Anyone else, it's not all right. Working in Catholicism, you can work with some of the dead, the saints, but in general, like, you do get, when it comes to anthropologists and tracing words back, things like necromancy are often equated to black magic.
Yeah. Not
because necromancy means black magic, it's because working with the dead was a real taboo.
Yeah. Certainly,
when the Romans got involved, when it was the Catholic Church, you know, early Christianity, when the Roman Empire took over Christianity, you've got things like desecration of corpses. You can't touch corpses.
Yeah.
And that did have a very negative knock-on effect, not just for magical practitioners, but also for modern medicine.
Yes.
I mean, it meant that if you were in medieval times a doctor or a medical practitioner that wanted to learn to
The
do
best way to learn is from a cadaver.
dissection. That's the thing. There are instances where you have doctors that are dissecting things and they're done for necromancy,
Yeah.
because although they won't necessarily believe, because there were a lot of atheists in the Middle Ages,
Yeah.
a lot of people don't seem to understand that, but not everyone believed in God and spirits and things like that.
But again, that comes down to the introduction to medieval.
Yeah.
Like, it comes down to we put everybody in the same box in the way that we bite-size history. But yeah, it is one of those where the medical profession was held back. In some ways, that's kind of why you call parts of that the Dark Ages.
Yeah.
Is because there is no progression in that. I think there's a really good part of, is it Frankenstein, that really kind of tries to play with that idea of the fact he's a medical doctor that is trying to reanimate life, but is actually, capable. He's having to steal bodies in order to do it. Whereas you're kind of like, well, actually, if it was at a period in time where medical study, he would have had cadavers readily available. So
would Frankenstein would be late Middle Ages, wouldn't he?
I would assume
Possibly later even.
Possibly later.
Yeah.
But you just kind of, you get that kind of feel in it that he's doing necromantic work.
And you've got to think about it in terms of horror and gore and spooky supernatural stuff. And obviously from the original Mary Shelley, Frankenstein's the doctor, Frankenstein's not the monster.
Yeah.
So you've got the fact that, okay, so a doctor trying to reanimate a corpse through science is the same as magic.
Yeah.
And that really is how the ancients kind of would have seen it.
Yes.
There is no distinction between science and magic. It's just, it's less understandable.
Yeah. It's what's known and what's unknown.
Yeah.
And that's the separation. Whereas now, kind of unknown is what falls into kind of magic category, what can't be proven.
Yeah.
Fact. Fact is only something that is generally accepted as being true. It's not truth. The two things are very different. And I think in a modern world, we kind of stumble on that, where actually, the scientists have proved it, so therefore it is true. Oh no, that's fact. Anyway, sorry, I went off on the tangent again. But
that's all right. That's what they like, isn't it?
It's necromantic practice. So, okay, so what would you expect a beginner to start with?
Well, from the beginner, it depends on, for me, what their experience level is and what their knowledge level is from an academic perspective. Because I tend to find people have some ideas about it. Whether they're right or wrong is besides the point.
Yeah.
A lot of people nowadays from secular kind of atheist perspective tend to get their ideas from horror.
Yeah.
Say their ideas are from, I don't know whether you'd call it bastardizations of folklore that go a little bit out of hand and get sensationalized.
The macabre.
Yeah. So that's their ideas. From religious people's perspectives, they already have a set belief system
and what is acceptable to do or not to
and
do.
ways of working to an extent in general. So if you started on altars and things like that for a Catholic with candles, they're going to be used to that ritualistic magic. For Catholics makes sense.
They're going to be used to an altar,
Yeah.
A vessel. They're going to be used to an offering. Those things are all naturally programmed into them. I wonder where they got the idea for that. But yeah, it's kind of that programming's already there.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I get to a certain extent when you come from the kind of Wiccan paths and stuff like that as well. They're very much built in that way too. Is a sense that it is honouring as opposed to necessarily working with, and therefore they'll probably start in that same kind of altar-esque manner.
More petitions, you mean?
Yeah.
Say more, please, can you?
Please,
Prayer.
can you?
But then,
Prayer.
I mean, when you look at Wicca, the vast majority of people in Wicca come from a Christianized background. Whether they were Christian
or their family
or not, they were certainly raised in the Western world, which, very
can't escape the
Christianized.
Christianization.
But I mean, there's one thing that I tend to see as the aim when it comes to basic necromantic work when you're starting it for the first time, and that is psychic development.
Yeah.
So I tend to try to push people away from employing and working with psychics, mediums, that kind of thing, despite us running psychic fairs and things. you should be doing it yourself. Now, the way in which you do that is developing psychic ability, and necromancy can be a good way and a good practice for doing that. Contrary to popular belief, I think it's quite a safe approach.
Yes.
So essentially, I'd like to tie what the person feels is the right approach, or what they imagine to be the right approach, in a way that makes them feel in their heart kind of, yeah, this really does feel like it should be. This should be the rules of the universe. This is how things should happen. And normally that involves around the sensing of energy. So normally the ancestral altar is kind of the prime example of that.
Yeah.
Not everyone can have ancestral altars, and some people are on specific paths. So I know that from certain cultures, if someone's from a specific culture or has an interest more than likely in a specific culture, what I'll try to do is frame that within a context that they might be used to. So for example, when it comes to Old Norse, which is a very, very popular thing nowadays, when it comes to Old Norse and not Christianized versions of Norse, you're talking about going to the dead, the places where the dead were, are. So you're not necessarily talking about elaborate rituals and things like that. What you are talking about is visiting places where the dead reside. Now, if you live in a city nowadays, that's going to be a cemetery at the end of the day. But, back in the day, they would have created their own versions of that. So, in terms of you going to the dead, I think that just spending some time amongst there, you will start to pick up slight energy. So in Bristol, there's a specific cemetery called Arnouthville. You've been there, of course. Absolutely beautiful. Half overgrown and half pristine. It's a non-conformist cemetery, so you get some very, very strange and interesting sculptures. It's also quite a large cemetery. We're lucky to have that here in the West within travelling distance, from where we live. But ultimately, the first thing I like to get people who are interested, so because we meet a lot of people which say they're interested but aren't committed to the path. Now, if you get someone that's interested but not committed, I tend to find that what is best is to ingrain that in modern culture. So generally speaking, it makes sense to people, well, someone's died, I'm going to go and visit the grave of such and such. Well, if you're taking that principle and thinking that, as some cultures do, that the dead are kind of linked to their physical remains, in that they can't really leave the vicinity, or that's their anchor point to the physical world. It's kind of something that you'd see that crops up throughout different cultures. Well, taking something that belongs to that person and creating an ancestral altar at home can be a good thing, whether it's a picture, whether it's a lock of hair, baby teeth, those kind of things. What you're trying to do is build up energy, and energy portal. I say portal. I normally say portal. But from the perspective of seeing if someone's serious, I normally say, look, go and spend some time with the death current, not trying to reach out to a specific dead person. Because what you need to get the feeling of is that the death current is energy for this type of work. It's the battery that you will often use for this kind of work. Not necessarily the only battery, there are other ways of doing it, but necromantic practice is Saturnine, essentially.
It's the most permanent access, isn't it? It's the fact that it is always going to be there. That streamline is always going to be an opportunity for you to tap into that current, and therefore, if you can get comfortable with that stream, that current, then these sorts of practices will be easier. So it's a case of spending that time in those spaces. So going to graveyards or going to sites where things, you might be in the part of the world where some battlefields are, or famous battlefields are, or Auschwitz. They're all places where that current is so obvious that just spending time in them and not trying to work with it, just getting used to how it tastes. I always use the word taste, but it's how it works for me. you know, how does it taste, how does it feel, what emotions come through with you when you're in that space, you know, so that you recognize those feelings, those energies, those tastes when you are in contact with them. Because at the end of the day, that's for, you know, it's just one of the practices that use that stream. But if you can identify the stream rather than the practice, then you have this continual part of, well, actually, I can tap into that for other things. And ultimately, that's what the whole point of ancestral work is, surely, or necromantic work is people fit into those two categories that we're ever talking about: those that want power and those that want knowledge. And eventually, if you're going to be spending a lot of time working in that particular field, you're going to be wanting one of those two things. And by power, we don't mean take over the world. We mean the energy in order to do other work,
to change. So ultimately, if you are exploring, as you know, normally suggest for you to explore death in its natural environment, so whether that be a cemetery, whether that be battlefields, that kind of thing, whether that be in certain wards where people die, you know, that kind of care.
Hospitals are a great place for that, unfortunately.
You've kind of got the idea that you are visiting the dead, you're visiting that place. You will start to get a feel for that energy, and it will be subtle at first. What you will find with bigger areas, so what I like to do with training people with Arna Spell is the fact that because it's a big cemetery, and because there are lots of very specific energy pockets within that cemetery, I like to get, and it really shows when people start to pick up on things like that. You get to develop a palette for the death current, and that acts then as a language to a certain extent. From that perspective, when you're delving into that, the next thing is to actually start to control it. So you do that by creating your and synthesizing the death current at home in a, I suppose you might even say, scientific environment, but your area. So whereas that naturally occurs, that death current's naturally strong in certain places in the world, if you take a clean space, whether it be a little alcove or something like that in your house, and you want to synthesize that death current and grow that a portal to that death current, now one of the best ways to do that is to take bits and pieces that already have that feeling, that essence, they're already tied to the death current. So one of the popular things nowadays is teaching people how to make necromantic incense. And we're developing a necromantic incense actually from our spell at the moment, where it will literally be made from plants and wildlife that grow in that death current, in that space. How many corpses they've fed on some of these plants, who's to know? But if you take things like that, it has an energetic charge. And what you're doing is you're identifying that, taking that, collecting them together, and then you'll start to see not just the palette in terms of, well, what this feels like, what does that do, why am I doing this, but also you're making that, you're growing it, you're making it stronger, you are putting your hands in through the veil and starting to manipulate things. And that's the thing that books can explain.
No, because well, think about it, it's nigh impossible to kind of find, or almost, because we have to do it all the time, try and find the words to explain to you how, because it's such a personal aspect of practice that the words I use to describe it might sound strange to somebody else. Their words for it may sound strange to me. We would recognize the energy signature of what they're playing with, and that's the idea. Like, you develop this palette for it so that that's what you do. You see somebody else's ritual space and you go, oh, I can see what they're doing there now. And we don't mean by, oh, there's a couple of black candles and a pentagram, like therefore they must be a Satanist. Like, you know, like it's more a case of I recognize that energy stream. It's why we're forever doing a scratch testing, but you know, with new clients and new mentors, mentees rather. But it's just you get a feel for what those spaces are trying to create. You will recognize what the incense must be for, but not just that there is incense there,
Yeah.
that there is incense there with a saturnine feel to it. If you get that same setup with a completely different feel, so perhaps that person specialises in battlefields, and actually they don't use the death current in that sense, and what they tend to then use is the Mars current, in which case you would kind of be going, oh, okay, this is a warrior ancestor program that they've got running here.
Yeah.
And actually what they're actually working in is stronger, more a physical working. That actually that's just a central point for what's going on in that space. So have I gone off on a tangent, or is that a relevant one?
I think that makes sense, but I think also the point that we needed to talk about, really, the elephant in the room, is what I like to call Googleable necromancy.
Yeah.
This is what people go to. This is the experiments that people tend to make, and that is, okay, what's everyone else doing? What tools do I need? What do I need to put in my Amazon wish list exactly in order to make these magical practices work? Now, you'll find that from what we've already talked about, visiting some of these places, unless you need to get membership or to pay an entrance fee to Auschwitz or National Trust or something like that, then really what you're doing is you can visit your local cemetery for free. You know, you can do all of that sort of stuff for free. You can take things from that. Now, that's all free. You don't need the quote-unquote ritualistic tools that you do tend to find people hawking to you. We run a witchcraft shop.
Yeah.
We sell ritual tools. Do you need them? Not necessarily. A tool is something that makes your life easier. And the most important thing is really to continue to push yourself to doing more and more yourself and not being reliant on tools. That being said, we need to go through a little list of necromantic tools, or Googleable necromancy tools, and really talk about how they work and why people use them. Why do these things keep cropping up? Is it just because it's in the culture? Is it because they really do work and add to someone's practice? I think the first thing really when we're talking about taking things from graveyards and stuff like that, we've got to talk about graveyard dirt, haven't we, really? And I mean, we've got a nice little bit down here. Graveyard dirt. So what is it that people use this mysterious graveyard dirt for? I mean, we do use it occasionally as an ingredient. I've used it in my personal practice as an ingredient, but I'd rather get someone else's take on the situation.
Drop me in it.
We'll see if we both agree, because that's the thing. People can use tools, something like this. People use it in different ways, and you will find certainly in the magical community there'll be lots of arguments in terms of whether it's even right to use this versus, you know, how you use it. What's the appropriate way to use it? Yeah. So what are your thoughts on graveyard dirt?
Well, you know, I don't use a lot of it in my work personally. But that's mainly because I don't work with that part of the death current when I tend to work with it. Ancestral altars, it's a great one as a replacement necessarily for me for incense. So yes, I would use it in incense, but also for me it's a nice replacement for it in that situation. The bit that gets complicated is lots of people with their kind of rights and wrongs of using it. You know, if you're taking graveyard dirt, like, you know, this particular batch I believe is the generic stuff, where you take it from the four corners of whatever you consider the four corners to be. We don't mean geographical points necessarily, but from the four corners of a graveyard site that are not digging. It's not from a grave, it's from a hallowed ground. So that is the aspect that is there, that is a created safe sacred space that it lives within that current, and therefore you are just wanting to sample the earth itself from that space. What's very different is when people use actual grave dirt, so directly from a person's grave. That's where it gets a little bit more tricky. And whether or not people are comfortable to do that in the first place. about whether or not various different methods of paying for it is always the big one for a lot of practitioners. We've had multiple conversations with practitioners, haven't we, where they're kind of, well, how do you pay for your grave dirt, or where do you specifically get it from? Sometimes it's people want to use it from a specific ancestor, so it might be a case of going back and asking great grandma. It's not going to be your latest. In most of the practitioners I've ever met, it's very rarely their immediate ancestors that they've seen die, which I always find is a bit strange, really, because if you're going to use some, surely you've got a stronger connection to the person that you knew in this lifetime rather than ones you didn't. But a lot of people do, don't they? They go for further down their ancestral tree. I don't know if it's they consider it they've been there longer, therefore it's truer grave dirt.
Well, when it comes
the feel for that?
When it comes to certain practices, what I personally say with graveyard dirt. So this graveyard dirt is taken from four corners of a graveyard. So it's not taken from a specific grave. The reason why I take this is because it helps to form a foundation for ingredients and things that are made. So necromantic incense, essentially, when you're talking about magical incense, they're supposed to permeate the room or the environment to help you create sacred space, to charge that sacred space with a specific type of current, or something that's not often talked about, to create an environment for a specific thing to manifest. So when you're talking about certain spirits, and the dead are quite a good example of that. Contrary to popular belief, actually, the dead can be quite weak when it comes to manifestation. That's the reason why most people, unless they've got, a fairly strong psychic ability, don't just see spirits all the time and hear them all the time. It's difficult for them to really, and I'm not saying that this is technically how it works, but for them to permeate and come into this environment. If you're talking about bringing a spirit in, particularly the death, the dead, creating an environment which makes it easier for the dead to manifest in, is one of the reasons why we create necromantic incenses and oils and things like that. That's essentially their function, creating sacred space. People get confused with the creation of sacred space and think, well, it's to keep certain things out. You're creating an environment that is cohesive and
for that
specific working. So when it comes to the graveyard dirt, that's not a specific person's grave. That is one ingredient that gets added to it, and you get the feel of the cemetery. You get the feel of things moving around when you add things like this. You can add it to anything. Don't eat it, obviously. But when it comes to graveyard dirt that you're taking from a specific grave, what you're essentially trying to do is, because nowadays in this country, certainly in the UK, it's illegal to dig up the corpse. So you're trying to get as close to the signature of that person as well. If a dead body has been marinating in a grave for a certain amount of time, you will find that it's certain, it doesn't just leak out, the energy leaks out, the signature of the remnants of that person.
It's felt in that entire space rather than just where the body is.
So what you tend to find in a lot of traditional kind of village, old-fashioned witchcraft, and a lot in hoodoo nowadays, is you would take graveyard dirt from a person's grave that you want to work with. Now, if it's a member of your family, you could do that because you want that signature. It's a signature of a specific dead person. Now, where it comes to getting graveyard dirt from someone that you don't know, essentially you'll find with a lot of traditional spells and things like that, when it comes to witchcraft, is that you will find, well, it calls for the ingredients of the dirt from a thief or something like that. That's really to do with spell casting and magical manifestation. So what you're talking about is using that signature to gain access and ask and pull through the spirit of that person. So you're targeting a person. You're not just taking random graveyard dirt. What you're using is you're using that graveyard dirt as a signature to latch onto, to reach through and pull the spirit or essence of that person.
So you're no longer working with just the death stream, you're wanting to work with a specific individual within that current.
And you're not necessarily just talking about graveyard dirt. Graveyard dirt's quite a common thing. If you look at this grave, for example, this is a picture that I took. Whoever planted the rosemary and it's obviously purposefully done, but you don't take necessarily the dirt. You could take a snippet of the flowers that are growing on the grave, whatever is picking up on that signature. So for example, when it comes to love magic and lust magic, you'll find certain spells that will ask you to get the graveyard dirt of a prostitute, for example, for lust, because they incite lust. If you're wanting to steal something, you would be asked for the graveyard dirt of a thief. If you're wanting a money spell, some spells will call for the dirt of someone rich. Okay, so you don't just have the energetic, profile essentially in the dirt of the person, but also there's a concept as well. Now, what a lot of people don't understand is the fact that really when it comes to animism or when it comes to dealing with spirits specifically, just adding that piece of graveyard dirt from that person's grave isn't necessarily going to help things. It might help you psychologically in terms of thinking about, oh, well, that makes sense, I'm going to put that in, and it kind of reinforces. But actually, you remember you're talking about a signature that you're supposed to reach through to pull through. So if you're talking about whether it's plant spirit animism, taking rosemary, for example, and asking the spirit of rosemary to help you when you're working, is not just like chemistry where you're just adding that ingredient and then it's done. It's not like hocus pocus, eye of bat, wing of newt, all of that kind of thing, or wing of bat, eye of newt. So the next thing, obviously, when it comes to popular things, is of course skulls. We've got a couple of skulls around us. We have a human skull, none. People can be a little bit put off by this, but there are reasons for that, and I think that the reasons for using human skulls aren't understood. I think the basic books don't really explain the situation when it
They say
comes
you
to
need
that.
one, they don't necessarily why or how.
Well, a lot of them don't even say that you do need one. I mean, the amount of ones where people say crystal skulls, and I get asked, can I use a crystal skull? And I say, well, you can use a crystal skull if that gets you into the focus, or you want that skull to pick up on the energy that you're constructing on the altar. If I took something like this, which is metal, and I put it on an ancestral altar, and that ancestral altar permeates this skull with that energy, it will start to retain a charge.
Yeah.
But the difference with an actual human skull is the fact that you will tend to find, and here's a secret. So if I pick None up, don't want to drop her jaw.
Don't drop her jaw.
I won't drop her jaw. So when it comes to actual human skulls, then that has held the spirit of a person for a considerable amount of time. Now,
it's programmed specifically to hold the spirit.
What you'll tend to find when it comes to centerpieces for altars, you will find a lot of skulls are used as centerpieces for altars. One of the reasons for that is that if you are practicing necromancy or wanting to pull a specific spirit in, that needs a vessel in order to, particularly when you're talking with the dead, because the problem with a lot of the dead is they can be quite confused.
Yeah.
And some of them don't even necessarily know they're dead. They're used to looking at the world through a skull. So you will actually find, and I've carried None around with me, driving through some random places, and they're almost like vacuum cleaners, skulls. Things get attracted to them and stick in them. We'll have to get our friend Lady Poison to tell you her story of the skull that was haunted at some other point, because we're not going to have enough time to talk about this today.
No.
But in terms of the technology, how this works, and the things that you may hear about when it comes to people talking about necromancy and the use of skulls. Now, there is a tradition whereby when it comes to the skull and consecration and things like that, that depending on the type of skull that you have, whether it has a jaw or not, will depend on the type of necromantic work you would normally do with it. So in traditional witchcraft, there's I suppose, what would you call lore?
Yeah.
I suppose it's kind of lore.
Mythology.
That With the jaw on a human skull, if the skull is complete and has the jaw, that skull can be used to talk. So it's essentially something that normally you would see on a hearth, normally made of obsidian. There is kind of a legend, or young traditional witches are taught that if it's your personal skull and you're the only one that uses it, then you would just use it like we use non. But if it was, for example, a coven that was using it, you would put it on a hearth, and the hearth is essentially, represents the fact that this skull is a focal point for multiple people.
Yeah.
Like the hearth around in a living room or lounge is where the family gathers, essentially. Yes. When you're talking about traditional craft, very family orientated, even though coven members might not necessarily be blood relatives, it's very much a family affair. Now, skulls without the jawline are normally seen as necromantic skulls, so ones which you will use to draw the energy in. So this isn't really supposed to, or wouldn't necessarily be seen to possess a specific human spirit. You're not pulling a human spirit into it and having it talk to you. It's normally kind of like a correspondence. I hate to say the word correspondence, but not too dissimilar from the graveyard dirt. It's supposed to be a focal point. Now, in my personal experience, I find this to be untrue. I think that whether it's got a jaw or not, it doesn't really
matter. If it wants to talk, it will talk.
If it wants to talk, it will talk. Now, one thing when talking about dealing with human skulls, obviously, in terms of where you're getting them from, in terms of, specific uses of human skulls, we are going to do a video on human skulls, because it is quite a large subject in itself. But what you will tend to find, if I take on and show the things that people pick up on. So the reason I use her isn't necessarily as, say, a spirit guide or something like that. So Non doesn't really necessarily, she's not attached to this soul. There's residue left from the person that she was in life, but there's no permanent residence, would you say? No permanent residence. In certain skulls you will find that there are spirits attached to them. So with Non, the spirit of the lady that we call Nan isn't necessarily there. There's a residue there, and we use this because it is a sacred object and because it's easy, because of the what we've kind of talked about in terms of naturally spirits feel at home with the dead looking out on this. It is designed to house consciousness. Skulls are designed to house consciousness, so why wouldn't you use that for your necromantic work? Now, one thing I do say, a little traditional witches, bit of trivia, I suppose, which I don't think they like me talking about, but I'm going to tell you anyway, because, this is the necromancy course. Now, in terms of demonstrations and things like that with skulls, now what people will tend to say is that when they start using skulls, they're drawn to specific areas, they're drawn to specific ways of working with it. Now, in terms of consciousness, for holding consciousness, holding the death energy in that, obviously Non, you can take her head off. There are situations whereby if you're using necromantic incenses, or even put it down gently, even things such as offerings, that sometimes the skull cap will be used for that. You've literally got consciousness. So in order to scry inside that, or in order to put offerings and things like that inside the skull, is one of those things that naturally people are drawn to doing. And you'll find many practitioners that don't necessarily know each other that all do the same principles. They all do the same things. They have the same kind of operating procedures. And there's reasons for that. And there's reasons for that we could probably go into, but this course is going to be an awful lot longer. In terms of where you're talking about other aspects of human skulls that people tend to tap into, you'll find that the back of the head tends to be a very, very popular one. Now, when it comes to possession work, particularly when it comes to spirits and dealing with the dead, you'll find that people complain about pressure on the back of their neck. Now, The legend of why that is, or what in terms of traditional witchcraft and the reasons why they say that is that that is the last place that your consciousness dwells in your skull. So if you're talking in terms of being buried, as most people are, you're buried like that. As your brain and everything else rots away, it sinks to the bottom. And that's the last bit of residue of your consciousness that will remain. Is the reason why a lot of people say, in terms of holding and tapping the bone, some people will tap on the top, tapping the bone, 1, 2, 3 to call the spirits in. Some people tap on the bottom. In terms of what works for you, it doesn't really matter, but really getting to know the tools that you're using, not being told how to use them. That's really something that I think we need to have an emphasis on, because when it comes to skulls and stuff like that, allow the tool to talk to you. And I don't necessarily mean physically talk, because this one sometimes does like to talk. But in terms of, you should organically being pulled towards things. And just because no one else is doing what you're doing doesn't mean it's not right. There's a reason why you'll be pulled towards working with certain tools and not others. And certainly in terms of tools that you're not necessarily using the same way as other people. Unfortunately, with the way the magical community is, they tend to like to say, well, you're not doing it right, I'm doing it right, this is how you do it, kind of thing.
Do it the way that understands you. Hence why I'm about to say, beyond none, I don't have any other body parts. But I must say, if I was going to keep a part of the body for necromantic work myself, I probably wouldn't use the skull. I'd probably more likely use the rib cage. Now that probably makes no sense to a lot of you.
I spent a lot of time as an Egyptian, and of course the soul lies within the heart.
It does. And therefore at that point, that cage positioning would be the more natural choice for myself, in order to use for housing anything, pulling something in and housing it. Obviously, but then maybe that's because I'm not necessarily interested in talking to whoever's coming, so I don't necessarily want their consciousness. What I want is their spirit and their core essence, rather than necessarily speaking to them. But I just thought I'd add that on, because when you're talking about human bones, there is that kind of, depending on what part of the body you are using, depends on what you're actually after. Again, I'm sorry to go back to the kind of Mars field, but obviously if you're going to want that, you're not necessarily going to want their skull. Let's face it, they're not particularly best known warriors for how they think necessarily, but you might want their arm, or the strength of their femur maybe, or
sympathetic magic, I suppose, representational magic.
And with that, therefore, apply those understandings that you already have of the human body when you are using human remains. And there is that kind of aspect of that. Right, moving on from that, there's one other big area we must cover, because it's in every kind of gory movie ever, and it is blood.
Oh, right. I thought he was going to start talking about physical necromancy then.
No, I wasn't going to talk about physical necromancy. We'll do a very small bit about that at the end. But blood.
Nice bit of blood.
So, what is the focus and the point of using blood? So for me, I automatically go to that kind of essence again. So, one way of guaranteeing that you've got an access to a specific person or a history line, if you're going and grabbing grave dirt from great-great-grandma, then another way to then link it from this side would be to necessarily use a drop or two of your own blood to kind of, if that's the link that you are relying on. Obviously, there are other uses for it. There are also other blood sources you could use if you're going to be, trying to curse an enemy or a bloodline or whatever. There are very many uses for blood and sorcery. But what about specifically with necromancy? So my main one would be linked directly. If we were to go back to the ancestors, there were specific, the ancient Greco-Romans, there is a set of sacrifices that are required for that to happen. It's the energy source required to permit access. So therefore, slaughtering one of the bravest or the strongest rams from your herd is a true sacrifice. Therefore, will buy you access to Hades' realm, because for them in that situation, there is a barrier to that you need to have crossed. In order to cross that, you need to pay the correct price. And I think blood in a lot of times it's sacrifice, it is payment.
Yeah, I think that one thing that beginners tend to notice is that not only do people understand nowadays that actually blood's quite an important part of the body, and that it is the life force of the body, it carries the nutrients around the body. DNA is essentially an imprint of you. Now there are other for certain specific types of magic, there are other bodily fluids that people also use that carry imprints of yourself. But in terms of blood,
for more directly,
I mean, as the saying goes, blood is lives. When it comes to your ancestors, all of them have given something to you. There is a story there within the blood. Now, there is work being done in terms of genetic memory, and memory is carried within the blood and that kind of thing. Which I'm not going to go into too much details on the science. We're going to just stick to the magical practice, because you can look up that in terms of Googling genetic memory. Do your own research on that. But in terms of the magical practice, if you're talking about in linear time, is what we're used to talking about as a human. You're talking about one ancestor and another ancestor getting it on, producing a child, that child meeting someone else, getting it on, producing a child. Things are carried, we know that things are carried genetically through our bloodlines. Your blood, currently, from the position that we're in now, unless you have a child, technically, for your lineage is the current refined standard, I suppose. So in terms of it carrying the memories and the links towards everyone that has gone before, everyone and everything that's gone before, essentially in the physical world. Blood, what did you say about blood being a river of lives and stuff like that? I think you said the other day.
It's one of those where it's a stream of consciousness in its own space. Every medical thing that's ever happened to you, so every illness you've ever had, it's all locked into that memory of your current. But it's also, if you've got, which is why you do genetic testing now, to see whether you're more susceptible to different kinds of cancer. Like, it is stored within that bloodline. Obviously for me, I try and stay clear of my blood. It doesn't particularly interest me. My family line is not particularly interesting. But then, we make choices. The question is whether or not you want to tap into that. Is the purpose of the work to attach to your bloodline the earthly lineage of your previous time here? And by that I don't mean you specifically. We're not talking about necessarily past lives. Obviously there are ways to make sure and use blood in order to make sure that you come back to a specific lineage. Why you would want to do that is beyond me, but we did talk about it in a podcast recently. So there is that kind of river of lives that are not yours but are of your earthly history.
Blood sorcery, putting it really, really simply, because we'd probably need to do an entire video dedicated to blood sorcery. You're talking about there being, blood is sacred, and it is sacred for a reason. Remember that obviously it is a link to your ancestors. So much like with graveyard dirt from a specific person's grave, with that graveyard dirt that comes from the four quarters, technically you could use it to draw through everyone else that's in that graveyard, but also the death current in general. When it comes to your blood and taking your blood, You could be using it to draw through and bring through any of your ancestors that have gone before. Now, another thing that tends to factor in terms of contracts and what you'll find is offerings and things like that. You have to remember that your blood is you. It is your genetic makeup. It is you. Therefore, when you are making symbolically an offering of blood, or if a spirit or something like that gets you to give you their blood to sign, I mean, you get the old idea of signing in blood a contract. You're signing your essence. You're putting your essence on that contract as a binding thing that you cannot escape because you're in this life, you're in this blood. This is your signature, an energetic signature. So whether it's stealing blood from someone else to get their link, their energetic signature, I mean, you can talk about putting it on poppets and that kind of thing, but their signature, or you freely remember giving it, you are giving your signature. And when it comes to the metaphysical world, this is not like one of these phone contracts you can get another company to buy you out of. When you put your mark freely as an offering, or your blood as an offering, that is your essence. You are fully acknowledging the fact that you are tying yourself into that contract. And we have to do a lot of these contract break-ins because people tend to think that blood sorcery is one of those things they can dabble in. It certainly isn't.
And also from a longer term point of view, is there are certain contracts attached to your blood. If you're unfortunate enough to have had a family line that make those kind of silly mistakes, is there is an essence of that person from that bloodline in your blood. Obviously it's a watered down version because the rest of you is there too, and all the people that were between you and them, but there is an established contract there. These particularly with spirit lines, you're talking about spirits that are going to long outlast your physical body. They are able to call back on contracts you have made. Again, why would you tie yourself to your same bloodline? Because those things can come back to bite you. But it's one of those, I think people take for granted what that bodily fluid, that sacred essence of yours is worth. I think that's the thing people fail to understand. It's bargaining worth. And therefore, I don't personally understand why you would need to use that. If you're obviously working with your own bloodline, that's different. That is just a birth link to them. But if you're then starting to use other entities within that spirit work, that's at the point where you need to be considering more about the consequences of using it. Some are easy to break than others, but at the end of the day, they are binding contracts. So.
Okay, so when it comes to the practicalities of necromancy, we've probably all seen one of these, a Ouija board or spirit board. Now, a lot of people, witches, tend to take the piss out of these. They tend to think that, well, that's just for paranormal investigators, people that don't know any better.
Children that want to play.
But in terms of this, if you think of it as a tool, because it is a tool, you've got the idea that the fact that this is a game, of course it was a game. That was when it was created and manufactured as a game. They were selling these in Toys R Us until Toys R Us went bust. Don't know if that was related or not, but who knows. In terms of progression with something like this, because the thing is, when it comes to toys and tools, some would say tools are toys, but you're talking about getting use out of something. So let's talk you through a situation with this. So you're probably aware how these work. If you're not aware how these work in terms of putting, your little planchette and that on and using that in a traditional way, then you can watch our video on that on the Thoth TV YouTube channel. But think about this. This can retain an energy. Now, there are clearance procedures in terms of what you're supposed to do to close down after using it, but they can retain a certain energy. Most people will say to get rid of that energy. What if you use this as the foundation for your altar? So if you have a Ouija board or something like this, it's probably an idea that you probably, you know, a lot of people will have experimented with these before. So if you're using this as your first foundational part of your altar, then literally just put it on the table. It's your first thing that you get if you were creating an ancestral altar. You don't have to, but I'm trying to take you on a progression. Now, from the perspective in terms of gathering things, obviously we've talked about our graveyard work. So if you're gathering things that you can feel the death current in, add these to your altar. When it comes to you trying to get a connection with the altar, with the dead, you could be talking about putting specific people on there that you know. I don't mean dead people, and I don't mean living people, and I don't mean killing living people to put parts of their body parts on there. But I mean, this is one of the things that's very traditional. It's a little pot. This one's skull shaped. Chris doesn't much like this pot, but it has in it petitions, essentially letters, things like that. Instead of, you know, trying to speak to the spirits through a medium and paying something like that, literally just have a pot on your ancestral altar that you get into the habit of leaving something for the spirits or a spirit that you want to talk to in it, or even writing them a letter. Now I'm not going to read these ones out as examples because these are actual letters that we've been given for our Dumb Supper ritual that will be happening on Saturday. So we're not actually going to be doing that because it's quite private. We tend to just burn them. It's tempting to read them, but we've never read them yet. So you can see there's an altar kind of setting up in general. Now what you're essentially trying to do is to create a little vortex that's going on here. That's what you want to do. So in terms of how are you going to start to interact with the dead? Well, you've got your petitions and things like that, but really what you want to do is kind of create a language to a certain extent. Okay, so when it comes to the language and communication in terms of with the dead, now the thing is with having ancestral altars and altars in general, a lot of people get a little bit uncomfortable with the fact that it's an open doorway. So you can create semi-permanent altars. We create them all the time for events where we'll create them, consecrate them, open up the space and then close them again. Obviously, traditionally, a lot of ancestral altars and shrines are permanent fixtures in the house. Because of that, you need to treat them with respect, but also I tend to get people to program a function of the doorway's open and you can come through, or the doorway's closed. The most simple way of doing that, I tend to find, is literally candles.
Yeah.
On and off.
The lights are on, people are at home.
If the lights are on, people are at home and it's an open doorway. If the lights are off, then you're talking about, okay, this is my time. Now, in terms of where people keep these ancestral altars, so there are several people in the world, because ancestral altars and shrines and things like that really are something that is so popular in other areas of the world, but not really so much in the West, other than in neo-pagan and pagan communities. But in terms of, obviously, your language and the way in which you're working through it, you're talking about spending some time there, adding it. You want to build the energy and then have ways in which that energy can manifest. So you're working on your psychic development by being able to sense and build that energy, because you will feel it. You know, we've not met anyone that can't feel it to a certain extent.
No.
Now, some people feel and have slightly more refined abilities than others.
Exceptions,
well, we're working with those
fault.
people. Yeah, we're working with those people. Certain medications like beta blockers can block psychic ability, but there are ways in which around that. So in terms of things like this, of course, you're then working on the communication. So what are you doing? Are you going to be using a spirit to help you with spells? In which case, for example, if I had a dirty, raunchy auntie, which I do, she's not dead, but if I did have her, a dead one, I may put a photograph of her on there. She was well into being a bit sleazy and liked to sleep around an awful lot. If I wanted to do lust magic, and lust spells for a client or for myself or some, for example,
She would be most useful.
she'd be very useful. So I would do that on the ancestral altar and pull her through or ask her to come through to help with that. So, you know, when it comes to that kind of thing, you've got to be thinking about, is it appropriate for the ancestral altar? Now, you will find that ancestral altars just have a habit of growing at an exponential rate. Excuse me. So you'll find that it may start off with a little side table and then it can suddenly go into massive. I mean, if you
Take
look
over
at
the wardrobe.
yeah, if you look at some of our ones, there's no reason why you can't keep it extremely simple. Some of the most simple ones I've seen is literally a little side table with 2 photographs and some flowers. You know, generally speaking, when it comes to ancestral altars, you'll see common themes. One is there will be things that are energetically charged to the people that you work with the most.
Yeah.
Another thing is that you'll have some form of way of working with them. So people that use crystal balls, for example, will put crystal balls on there. Some people like to leave tarot cards or whatever their medium of communication with. What we tend to say is to try and push your abilities further and further. So if you're just used to gazing in a crystal ball, that kind of thing, then you're going to want to start trying to get them to talk to you and to listen. The more time you spend manipulating energy, the more you'll be able to pick it up as well. So it's one of those funny things that it works a lot like I wanted to say physiotherapy.
Yeah.
If you wake up out of a coma and you forget how to walk and how your legs work, a physiotherapist will move your legs. They can't tell you this is what it feels like, this is how you do it. You have to learn from actually doing it, or your arm, or whatever it is. One of the great things about coven work is the fact that when you've got a group of practitioners that are doing magic together, and you have what they might call a weakling, a new person, someone that doesn't have much psychic ability, comes in and joins that group, you'll find that it really sparks them. I don't know if you find this. I tend to find that it really sparks them and helps them to, you know, absorb that kind of psychic ability. When you're working on your own, if you're a solitary practitioner, you might not have that, but this helps with that because there's energy there. So literally it's a case of growing that energy. You don't need to grow it by adding more and more stuff, but you want to be able to feel the energy and pull more energy through, and that is done through use, essentially.
Yeah. You'll get more out of using something on a regular basis than you will by adding more and more stuff to it. You know, like I said, like you say with the physio, it is about using that muscle. The more that you use that muscle, the stronger it becomes, the more resilient it becomes, and the easier the work becomes. So if you, you know, at first you'll start by lighting the candle. Some people might feel at that point when they first begin, they say some kind of little prayer or poem or whatever that kind of gets them into the zone, because they need that additional to get them into the zone. You know, it's the main reason so many people use tools. Having that in your hand automatically, psychosomatically puts you in that place subconsciously, ready to go. And that's just kind of what you're needing to do, is you just need enough there that triggers that point until you are used to going to that place without them. So that doesn't mean that your altar is going to necessarily get smaller. It just means that you won't need to be at the altar to connect with those energies. So it's not that you are aiming to shrink your altar and make it disappear. That is there for the honouring part. It's for the thank you. You maintain that part as maintaining that connection. It's for house cleaning, kind of housekeeping work of maintaining that connection. Like I said, we use them temporarily, but there is a set box they all go into. That energy is held within that space, even when we are not working with it, because they hold the residue of the work that we do with them. We also have the wonderful Santa that looks after them, but you know, that's how we choose to work. But mainly that's because we are doing that publicly. So, you know, we need that space when it is open at an event to be stable. so that other people that are not practiced, lots of mundanes that get involved in writing letters to their loved ones in order for it to be submitted to the earth at the height of Samhain, it is a case of that allows that to facilitates it in a safe environment. We know that space, we understand how that space works. If something started to go awry, we would notice. Whereas someone that is beginning out on a process of working with the Saturnine for the first time, or working with their ancestors specifically for the first time, it is a strength exercise. It will get better the more frequently you do it. That doesn't mean it's one of those things that you must do every day or on the same day each month. You arrange that arrangement with that setup when you do it. But yeah, the most simple ones I'm used to seeing are, again, probably flowers, a candle, sometimes a glass of water, or something like that, where it's a regular offering of kind of, and for me it might be a case of what you then do with that water. So once it's done, it's then a case of, oh well, I've got this particularly Saturnine plant outside that I will water. When you change the water, you're then still submitting that to somewhere else.
Yeah, the energy currents that you pick up through this, that's the thing. Your palate will become more sophisticated. You'll get to feel more flavors within an overarching flavor. Think of sweetness, okay? If something is sweet compared to savory, think of sweetness as a deaf current, okay? There are lots of different sweet flavors though. So in terms of the deaf current, you may be talking about an overarching feeling, and it can feel stronger or weaker, but then there are other specific types. Now, when it comes to working with spirits, you'll find that you can sense their composition, what they're made up of, which does give you a idea of what they rule over to a certain extent. Also, in terms of specific plants, offerings, things like that, ingredients in a spell, that's what the spell books don't tell you. So in terms of you being able to sense what currents there are, because there's more than the deaf current, of course. Obviously we're talking about the deaf current because we're talking about necromancy, but building a palette and being able to not rely on a book to tell you what this ingredient is for, because it will tell you. You will say, well, this feels Saturnine, this feels like this reminds me of this, and the more research that you do into that, normally you'll find, oh well, that's very strange, that only grows on corpses or something like that. That seems to be a plant that seems to thrive in graveyards, you know, that kind of thing. Now, when it comes to things like that, very often the books will describe it as, well, this tree you tend to find it in graveyards, therefore that is why it is associated with death, you know.
The yew tree is
a perfect example. However, what they don't get is you need to remember that the yew tree, yes, they're there for a reason in terms of what the reasons why they do plant yew trees in graveyards. We can go into that because I wouldn't say it's controversial, but there's many thoughts on that. But think about that tree is growing there and thriving there. It lives on that energy. That energy is infused in it. It has known nothing else other than that energy because it's grown
in that space
for its entire life.
So it's already poisonous. I imagine the ones that grow in graveyards are extra poisonous, you know?
Yeah. Okay, so we can't really talk about ancestral altars without talking about offerings. This is not an offering, this is an offering bowl. This tends to be one that gets burnt, it's scorched, quite literally. I like burning things, okay? Now, in terms of the procedure for offerings, why would you want to make an offering to a spirit?
Well, first, the most traditional way of working with spirits, I guess, is because it comes from traditional work ancestrally with Greco-Romans or whatever tribes you're originally from will have used offerings as petitions.
So bribes? Are we talking about bribes?
We're talking about bribing the gods.
Okay.
That's what we're talking about doing. So I want to offer this. you need to do this. It's contract. However, there is also this aspect. So a large part of it is that if you're asking for specific spell work, specific answers, you might need to pay the price. There's a lot of hoodoo practice that involves asking Bubba about I need help with this, I need the strength to do this, I brought your favourite foods. Like, there is a big part of that within kind of hoodoo and voodoo kind of arrangements. It is that barter system of, well, I make this better than Uncle Ralph, so therefore, you're going to do it for me though, aren't you? Like, that is that kind of arrangement where it is bribery, it's a petition. You then have the flip side where offerings are there not necessarily as a payment, but as a thank you, is a I am grateful that you have helped me.
It's the thought that counts.
Yeah.
Okay, a death spirit might not actually eat the offering,
No.
but if you don't give them something, it does feel like you're using them at the end of the day. But in terms of offerings and offerings that you use, I think, like me, probably the most common one you use is spring water. So
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about spring water?
So the beauty of water in general is the fact that it is, known to be the only element that exists on all planes. So there is water in the spirit realm. So there is that availability for it to transcend. So therefore that availability, that transmutation, the beauty of a liquid in itself is that it will fill any vessel. It will fill every shape comfortably. It will adapt. And that's why I think I like water more than anything. The extra is we like to use spring water specifically because it is sprouted from the earth. So to give something then that is going to be returned to the earth has a certain symmetry to it that makes it comfortable. Spring water, there are lots of different waters that you could use. If you're on the ocean front, you're not going to go inland 200 miles to find spring water. You're probably going to use salt water from the ocean. For me personally, it's the journey. I like the sacrifice of that trip to collect it as the payment for that working. It feels comfortable with me. I also like the fact that it's not something you've got to have difficulty trying to dispose of. The fact that it is natural and is there, after it's spent some time on an altar,
it will disappear.
It will disappear. It will either evaporate or if there is still left afterwards, it's a case of that can be disposed of easily, given to a water source, poured down the sink, water the plants with it.
So let's start tying some of this stuff that we've kind of talked about together, and let me talk you through an actual ritual. Now, you may have noticed I've had a little bit of a shave and things look a little bit different to our previous talk earlier on in the video. That's because we are now in the future. We are on the 31st of October, Halloween night 2020. We've just finished, about half an hour ago, our dumb supper. A dumb supper is a ritual, sometimes called a red dinner or silent supper. It's something that's becoming increasingly more and more popular. Now, the origins of the dumb supper actually had nothing really to do with necromancy and communication with the dead. It was actually a ritual that was supposed to be used to divine your future spouse, your future husband or wife. Now, at some point, things changed and the ritual has essentially been adapted to be used to open yourself up to and allow spirits to come through. It's an especially good ritual for beginners, and it's actually a really incredibly safe ritual. Now, you may notice we have an ancestral altar. You may also notice that here is the spring water that you just saw me collect. Now, ritualistic offerings are big in the dumb supper. Essentially, a dumb supper is a 3-course meal that you have and your guests have with the dead. The dead are set a place at the head of the table, in which case they are at the head of this table, our dining table, the ancestral altar. You would cook a 3-course meal. Because of COVID, we haven't been able to do this publicly. This is normally a public ritual that we would have quite a few people attend, 20 odd people normally. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to do that this year. Rather than cancel, me and Chris thought it would be a nice idea for us to actually still hold it. So this is after our dumb supper. Essentially, like I said, 3-course meal, sacred space created. We dine with the spirits. A portion of the food is given to the spirits. So there are 3 meals prepared this evening. 1 for me, 1 for Chris, and 1 for the spirits. The spirits are always served first. So the offerings, essentially, other than the spring water, are the same things that we're having. So what we eat and drink, the spirits will be given a portion of. It's a respect thing. Respect can get you quite a lot when dealing, it can get you to some amazing places, believe me, when dealing with spirits, sentient things. It is very important. You don't want to be like these paranormal investigators that just go and shout and scream and force your way. Actually, much like in the physical world, respect can go a long way. Now, the purpose of this ritual, not only is it to help you focus and help with psychic development, is the fact that opening yourself up, a lot of the time in traditional literary works, when it comes to necromancy, you see a lot of forcing the dead to do your bidding. You'll see it a lot in grimoires and things like that. That's not, although there are some instances where that is used, I don't think that it's as common as a necromantic practice as what some of these grimoires and things would have you believe. Why work with something that doesn't want to work with you? This is about fostering relationships. When you start working in necromancy, when you start working with the dead, it should be starting to foster a relationship, not only with the dead in general, but the death energy current itself. Eventually, death will manifest for you within that energy current. So when you start off, you may want to start trying to work with specific people that have crossed over that you know, building your little ancestral altar, adding their pictures, such and such. But eventually, you'll get more and more come through. People will come through that you don't necessarily know. You might have 1 or 2 bad experiences with negative spirits, that kind of thing. But that will be something that you'll be able to cope with because of the fact that you've started simple and you've worked up. Starting simple, that is something that you don't tend to see in witchcraft. Everyone wants the complicated spell. They think the complicated thing is the thing that's going to work the best. That's not always the case. In fact, a lot of the time it's not the case, for the simple reason that the more complicated something is, probably the less chance you will actually understand it. What can be more simple when working with the dead than sharing a meal? You'd go out and have a meal with your friends. You'd listen to your friends, hopefully, unless you're one of those people that just talk. But something like that, you can take the most simple practice, such as a meal, and make it magical. This is essentially what the person or people that have designed and adapted this ritual have done. The very fact that you're silent, you are taking the emphasis and you're stopping your conscious mind from going on and on and on. You're opening yourself up. When it comes to spirit contact, unless you're specifically have quite a strong psychic ability, the chances are what you'll need to do is start to understand it subtly, start to pick up on things subtly. These sorts of rituals are really good ways of doing that. You can do meditation during the ritual. If you set up ancestral altars and things like that, you can do that meditation, that opening up. That is the spark, that's the start. From then on, you'll start to feel things. Then you'll start to hear and see things.
this is something that, again, it's simple, and the reason why people get confused is that it's too simple. People think that, oh, well, it can't be that simple, surely. But actually, it really is. It's just a case of running with it. Don't stop, keep going and pushing yourself more and more and more. Dumb Supper is something that you can do at home. There are a lot of necromantic rituals which do seem quite complicated. There are a lot of ones that are based on specific cultures from the past, ancient cultures, regional and folklore traditions. But ultimately, there's nothing wrong with you once you understand the basics of how ritual spaces work, and with the being specific about what you're trying to do. I don't want to say it's all about intention, because it's not all about intention, but think about things. Don't just follow someone else's spell or ritual. Really think about, how is this working? What's the symbology used? Why does this work? Okay. Again, if you want to find out more about the Dumb Supper ritual specifically, then you can look up the Dumb Supper on the thothwitchcraft.com website. You might even have attended one of ours, or you're more than welcome to attend one of ours. We always hold it at end of October time, when the veil is said to be at its thinnest. So this again is quite a simple ritual. So hopefully this might get you starting to think, well, actually, I might think that this necromancy stuff isn't as complicated as I was led to believe it is, and it's really not. So have a little think about things that you can adapt that would involve bringing the dead in. The most simple thing that we always get people to do is to write letters. Now, nowadays, obviously, we're used to emails and text messages and things like that. We're used to being able to type what we want, and then if it's wrong, backspace, delete it. When you sit down and actually write a letter, put physical paper to physical pen, you're actually really focusing on your message a lot more than if you're just sending a voice memo or actually typing an email, stuff like that. If you really start to think and put your energy towards that connection, there's a lot to be said for that, and it really does show. Here's an example of quite a lot of letters that people have left on our ancestral altar, because we take this kind of setup throughout the UK when we do all of our events. We leave it set up in a sacred space, kind of away from the rest of what's going on in the events, and people will pick up pen, paper, and write little letters and things like that. It's amazing. Normally we have a lot more than this by the end of the year, but because of COVID in 2020, we haven't done as many events as we normally would do. What we tend to do is start this ancestral altar around about January, and then October will be the last one of the year. We travel around a lot and do a lot of events, so we're always packing it up. If you had something in your home, then it's most likely going to be something that you kind of put in a little alcove or something like that. That's going to be permanent. This one's not permanent. It gets added, and it added to normally by the people that work with it, our clients, people that attend our events. There's always offerings and things like that that are left. Normally at the end of the season, so in October time is our last event. Later on tonight, we will be taking all of the offerings and burning them, and the remains will be buried along with the remains from the Dumb Supper in a cemetery that's local to us. So there we go. Have a little think about what necromantic rituals you might be able to make, because just because no one's done it before doesn't mean that you shouldn't give it a go. Be creative about this sort of thing. Obviously, rituals have been created by people in the past. It is a lot better to follow your intuition a lot of the time than it is to rely on some stuffy old kind of procedure. There are reasons why things are put in some of these procedures, but at the end of the day, be creative. Magic is going to be about experimentation. You're not going to be able to do everything perfect first time. It's about whether you can, creatively get around problems and obstacles. If you read all of the books that there are about witchcraft, eventually you'll run out of things to copy, and you're going to have to start creating things yourself, pushing yourself further. There may come a time when you are a super witch, when you are the person that has pushed to the end of where foundational magic ends, and that there is no more content out there. There is nothing else for you to do, and you're going to have to be creative at that point. You're going to have to try things out that you don't necessarily know are going to work. You're not going to have the source material. You're not going to have someone else saying, well, I've done that, this is how you do it. So just try it out. Obviously, you're most likely going to be able to get on contact with us through Facebook or through the Fourth Witchcraft Patreon. If you do have any specific questions, we're always there to try and help as best we can. But magic is one of those things. It's practical. Witchcraft is a craft. You need to do it.